Chapter 1. The Hollows of Willow Creek. The rain fell in sheets, a relentless downpour that turned the gravel road into a river of mud. Ethan Carter gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white as the headlights of his battered pickup truck cut through the darkness. The windshield wipers groaned, struggling to keep up with the storm, and the faint smell of mildew seeped through the vents. He hadn't been back to Willow Creek in over a decade, and the town had a way of pulling you in, whether you wanted it to or not. The sign welcoming him to Willow Creek was barely legible, the paint peeling and the wood warped. Population: 1,243, it read, though Ethan doubted there were even half that many souls left. The town had always been a place of quiet decay, but now it felt like a graveyard. The streets were empty, the storefronts boarded up, and the only light came from the flickering neon sign of Holt's Pawn Shop. Ethan slowed the truck as he passed the old church, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine. He could still hear the hymns, the way they echoed through the hollows on Sunday mornings. But now, the church was silent, its windows shattered and its doors sealed shut. He turned onto Maple Street, the tires splashing through puddles as he approached the house at the end of the road. The Carter family home had once been a proud structure, a two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a garden that bloomed with wildflowers. Now it was a shadow of its former self. The paint was faded, the roof sagged, and the garden was overrun with weeds. Ethan parked the truck and sat for a moment, staring at the house. He hadn't set foot inside since the night of the fire. The night Clara disappeared. The memories came flooding back, unbidden. The crackling of flames, the acrid smell of smoke, the sound of Clara's screams as she begged him to save her. He had tried, God knows he had tried, but the fire had been too fierce. By the time the firefighters arrived, the house was engulfed, and Clara was gone. Ethan shook his head, trying to push the memories away. He grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped out into the rain. The cold water soaked through his jacket almost instantly, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the house, on the ghosts that waited for him inside. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of charred wood. Ethan flicked on the flashlight he had brought with him, the beam cutting through the darkness as he stepped inside. The house was frozen in time. The furniture was still in place, covered in sheets that had turned gray with age. The walls were stained with soot, and the floorboards were warped from the water the firefighters had used to douse the flames. Ethan moved slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He made his way to the living room, where the fire had started. The walls were blackened, the furniture reduced to ash. But there, in the corner of the room, was the one thing that had survived: the old rocking chair. It had been Clara's favorite, the place she would sit for hours, reading or staring out the window. Ethan approached the chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the wood. It was smooth, untouched by the flames. He couldn't understand how it had survived when everything else had been destroyed. As he stood there, a sound broke the silence. A faint whisper, so soft he almost missed it. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, shining the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing there, just the shadows, stretching and twisting in the dim light. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no response, just the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. Ethan shook his head, trying to convince himself it had been his imagination. But deep down he knew better. The house was alive with memories, with the echoes of the past. And Clara's voice was one he would never forget. He left the living room and made his way upstairs, the stairs creaking under his weight. The second floor was in better shape than the first, though the walls were still stained with soot. He walked down the hallway, stopping at the door to Clara's room. The door was closed, the handle cold to the touch. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. He wasn't sure he was ready to face what was on the other side. But he had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He pushed the door open, the hinges squeaking in protest. The room was exactly as he remembered it. The walls were painted a soft pink, the bed covered in a floral quilt. The shelves were lined with books, their spines cracked and faded. And on the desk, next to the window, was Clara's journal. Ethan crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He picked up the journal, the leather cover soft under his fingers. He opened it, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was familiar, the loops and curves of Clara's script bringing a lump to his throat. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the words. Most of the entries were mundane, the musings of a teenage girl. But as he reached the last few pages, the tone changed. The writing became frantic, the words scribbled in haste. Asterisk, they're watching me. I can feel their eyes on me, even when I'm alone. I don't know who they are, but they're not human. They're something else, something dark. And they want me to join them. Asterisk. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words. He had always known Clara was troubled, but he had never imagined it was this bad. He turned the page, his heart racing. Asterisk, I found the photograph. The one from the bonfire. I don't remember taking it, but I'm there with Samuel and the others. They're chanting something and I'm holding a knife. I don't know what it means, but I'm scared. I think they're coming for me. Asterisk. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Samuel Voss, the town's mayor, had always been a figure of authority in Willow Creek. But Clara had never mentioned him before, not in any of her letters or phone calls. What had she gotten herself into? He closed the journal, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he knew there was only one place to find them. The rain had let up by the time Ethan left the house, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moonlight. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness as he drove toward the center of town. Holt's pawn shop was the only place still open at this hour, its neon sign casting a sickly green glow over the street. Ethan parked in front of the building and stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The shop was cluttered, the shelves lined with trinkets and oddities. Behind the counter stood Marcus Holt, a grizzled man in his late 50s with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes narrowing. Ethan Carter, Marcus said, his voice rough. I wondered when you'd show up. Ethan approached the counter, his hands clenched into fists. I need to know what happened to Clara, he said, his voice low. Marcus took a drag from his cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke. You're asking the wrong questions, kid, he said. It's not what happened to her. It's what she found. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Marcus leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Clara stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. Something the town's been hiding for generations. And now it's coming for you too. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What is it? Marcus shook his head. I've said too much already. But if you want answers, you'll need to talk to Samuel Voss. He's the one who knows the truth. Ethan's mind raced. Samuel Voss had always been a figure of authority in Willow Creek. But Clara's journal had painted him in a different light. What had she discovered? And what did it have to do with the fire? He turned and left the shop, the bell jingling behind him. The rain had started again, the drops cold against his skin. He climbed into his truck and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. He had come back to Willow Creek to find closure, to put the past behind him. But now he realized the past was just the beginning. And Clara's voice was still calling to him, from somewhere deep in the hollows. Chapter 2. The Unraveling Letter. The rain had turned into a steady drizzle by the time Ethan reached the motel on the edge of town. The Willow Creek Inn was a relic of the 1950s, its neon sign flickering weakly against the gray sky. The parking lot was empty, save for a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Ethan parked his truck and grabbed his duffel bag, the weight of Clara's journal heavy in his pocket. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and mildew. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with a cigarette dangling from her lips, her eyes glued to a small television playing a soap opera. She didn't look up as Ethan approached. Room for the night, he said, his voice hoarse. The woman glanced at him briefly before sliding a key across the counter. $20. No parties, no pets, no trouble. Ethan handed her the money and took the key, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was cold, paper-thin, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. He nodded and turned toward the stairs, the sound of the television fading behind him. Room 12 was at the end of the second-floor hallway, its door slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open, the hinges squeaking in protest. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. The wallpaper was peeling, and the carpet was stained, but it was clean enough. He dropped his bag on the bed and sat down, pulling Clara's journal from his pocket. The leather cover was warm from his body heat, and he ran his fingers over it, hesitating. He had read enough to know that Clara had been scared, that she had stumbled onto something dark. But he wasn't sure he was ready to face the rest. Before he could open the journal, there was a knock at the door. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the thought of someone knowing he was here sent a chill down his spine. He stood and approached the door, his hand hovering over the knob. "Who is it?" "It's Lila," a woman's voice replied. "Lila Green. I'm a journalist. Can we talk?" Ethan hesitated, then opened the door a crack. Standing in the hallway was a woman in her late 20s. Her dark hair pulled into a messy bun and her glasses slightly askew. She wore a trench coat that was too big for her, and her boots were caked with mud. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice guarded. Lila held up a manila envelope, her expression serious. "I think I have something that belongs to you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" She handed him the envelope, her fingers brushing against his. "Just open it." Ethan took the envelope and stepped back, allowing her to enter the room. He closed the door behind her and sat down on the bed, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. He unfolded it and stared at the handwriting, his breath catching in his throat. It was Clara's. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything, but I didn't want to put you in danger. There's something wrong with this town, something evil. They've been lying to us, hiding the truth. I found something I shouldn't have, and now they're coming for me. If you're reading this, it means they got to me first. But you have to keep going. You have to find the truth. Start with Marcus Holt. He knows more than he's letting on. And whatever you do, don't trust Samuel Voss. He's not who you think he is. I love you, Ethan. Be careful. Ethan's hands shook as he read the letter, his mind racing. Clara had written this after she disappeared. But how had it ended up in Lila's hands? He looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Where did you get this?" Lila sat down in the chair by the window, her expression grim. "It was in a box of old files at the newspaper office. I've been digging into the history of Willow Creek for a story, and I came across it. I didn't know what it was at first, but when I saw your name, I knew I had to find you." Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. "Why? What do you want from me?" Lila leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I want to know the truth. About Clara, about the fire, about what's really going on in this town. And I think you do too." Ethan looked down at the letter, the words blurring as tears filled his eyes. Clara had been trying to warn him, to protect him. But from what? "Marcus Holt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She mentioned him in the letter. And in her journal." Lila's eyes lit up. "You have her journal?" Ethan nodded, pulling it from his pocket. "I found it in her room. There's something in here, something she didn't want anyone to see." Lila reached for the journal, but Ethan pulled it back, his grip tightening. "Not yet. I need to know I can trust you." Lila held up her hands, her expression earnest. "I'm on your side, Ethan. I want to help you find the truth. But we need to work together." Ethan hesitated, then handed her the journal. "Start with the last few entries." She was scared, Lila. Really scared. Lila opened the journal and began to read, her eyes scanning the pages. As she read, her expression grew darker, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she finished, she looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide. "This is bigger than I thought," she said, her voice trembling. Clara wasn't just scared. She was terrified, and she had every reason to be. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Lila closed the journal and handed it back to him. "I've been researching Willow Creek for months, and I've come across some disturbing things. Disappearances, strange rituals, a cult that operated in the shadows. And it all leads back to Samuel Voss." Ethan's stomach churned. Samuel Voss had always been a respected figure in Willow Creek, a man of power and influence. But Clara's journal had painted him in a different light. "What do you know about him?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Lila hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was old, the edges frayed and the colors faded. She handed it to Ethan, her hands trembling. "This was taken at a bonfire in the woods, about 20 years ago," she said. "Recognize anyone?" Ethan took the photograph and stared at it, his heart skipping a beat. In the center of the image was Samuel Voss, his face illuminated by the firelight. Surrounding him were a dozen figures, their faces obscured by hoods. And standing next to Samuel, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, was Clara. Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the photograph, his mind racing. Clara had been at the bonfire, but she hadn't been there willingly. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she held herself. She had been scared, just like in her journal. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila leaned forward, her eyes intense. "It's proof, Ethan. Proof that Samuel Voss is involved in something dark. And if we're going to find out what happened to Clara, we need to start with him." Ethan looked up at her, his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" Lila's expression was grim. "I'm saying we need to confront him. Tonight." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. Samuel Voss was a powerful man, with connections and influence. Confronting him would be dangerous, but Ethan knew he didn't have a choice. Clara's voice was still calling to him, from somewhere deep in the hollows, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. "Let's go," he said, standing up and grabbing his coat. Lila nodded, her expression determined. "We'll take my car. It's less conspicuous." Ethan followed her out of the motel room, the rain soaking through his jacket as they made their way to her car. The streets of Willow Creek were empty, the town silent except for the sound of the rain. As they drove towards Samuel Voss's mansion, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move, the trees leaning in as if to listen. And somewhere, deep in the hollows, Clara's voice whispered his name. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was ready to face it. Chapter 3: Blood Beneath the Church Bell. The drive to Samuel Voss's mansion was tense, the silence between Ethan and Lila heavy with unspoken questions. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the clouds hung low, casting the town in a gray, oppressive gloom. Lila's car, an old sedan with a sputtering engine, felt like a fragile shell against the weight of what they were about to do. Ethan stared out the window, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. The photograph Lila had shown him was burned into his mind. Clara's face, pale and terrified, standing next to Samuel Voss at that bonfire. What had she seen? What had they done to her? "You sure about this?" Lila asked, breaking the silence. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "No," Ethan admitted, "but I don't have a choice. Clara's counting on me." Lila nodded, her expression grim. "Voss isn't going to just hand over the truth. He's powerful, Ethan. If he's involved in what happened to Clara, he's not going to let us walk away." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have to be careful." The mansion loomed ahead, its wrought iron gates casting long shadows across the road. The house itself was a sprawling structure of stone and ivy, its windows dark and foreboding. Lila parked the car a short distance away, and they approached on foot, the rain soaking through their clothes. As they reached the gates, Ethan noticed something strange. The lock was broken, the chain hanging loose. He exchanged a glance with Lila, who shrugged and pushed the gate open. The grounds were eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under their feet. The front door was slightly ajar, and Ethan's stomach churned as he pushed it open. The air inside was cold, the scent of mildew and something metallic hanging heavy in the air. "Hello," Ethan called, his voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no response. They moved through the mansion cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The walls were lined with portraits of the Voss family, their eyes seeming to follow them as they passed. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "This place gives me the creeps," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his hand brushing against the journal in his pocket. It felt like a lifeline, a connection to Clara that he couldn't let go of. They reached the study, its door slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor and furniture overturned. In the center of the room was a desk, its surface covered in blood. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What the hell happened here? Lila stepped closer, her eyes wide with fear. "This is fresh. Someone was here recently." Ethan's mind raced. Had Samuel Voss been attacked? Or was this something else entirely? Before he could process the scene, a sound broke the silence. A faint, metallic clang, like a bell ringing in the distance. Ethan and Lila exchanged a glance, then followed the sound, their footsteps quickening. The sound led them to the basement, its door slightly ajar. Ethan pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly. The stairs were steep and narrow, the air growing colder as they descended. At the bottom of the stairs was a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, their contents obscured by shadows. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface stained with blood. And hanging above it, swaying gently, was a church bell. Ethan's stomach churned as he approached the altar, his eyes scanning the room. The shelves were filled with strange objects. Bones, jars of liquid, and what looked like human hair. But what caught his attention was the photograph pinned to the wall. It was the same photograph Lila had shown him, the bonfire, Samuel Voss, and Clara. But this time, he noticed something he hadn't before. In the background, barely visible, was a figure wearing a mask. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "What is this place?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know, but it's not good." As he spoke, the bell above the altar began to ring, its sound deafening in the small space. Ethan and Lila covered their ears, their eyes wide with fear. And then the shadows moved. Figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved silently, their footsteps echoing in the room. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized they were surrounded. "We need to get out of here," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the room for an exit. But before they could move, one of the figures stepped forward, its voice low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. Ethan's blood ran cold. He recognized that voice. It was Samuel Voss. Before he could react, the figures closed in, their hands reaching for him. Ethan fought back, his fists connecting with flesh, but there were too many of them. He felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and the world went dark. When he woke up, he was lying on the cold stone floor, his hands bound. Lila was next to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Samuel Voss stood over them, his expression unreadable. "You should have stayed away," Voss said, his voice cold. "But now that you're here, you'll see the truth." Ethan's mind raced as he struggled against the ropes. The truth. That's what Clara had wanted him to find. But at what cost? As Voss turned to the altar, Ethan noticed something on the floor beside him. It was a shard of glass, sharp and jagged. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the edge. And then, the bell began to ring again. The sound was deafening, the vibrations shaking the room. Ethan's hands trembled as he worked to cut the ropes, his eyes locked on Voss. "We need to move," he whispered to Lila. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. As the bell reached its crescendo, Ethan cut through the ropes and grabbed Lila's hand. They ran for the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. But as they reached the top, Ethan realized something was wrong. The mansion was gone, replaced by the ruins of the old church. The bell tower loomed above them, its bell ringing wildly. And standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're too late." Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for her, but she vanished into the shadows. The bell stopped ringing, and the world went silent. Lila grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "What the hell was that?" Ethan shook his head, his mind reeling. "I don't know, but we need to find out." As they ran into the night, the rain soaking through their clothes, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move, the trees leaning in as if to listen. And somewhere, deep in the hollows, Clara's voice whispered his name. The truth was out there, waiting for him. And he was running out of time. Chapter 4: The Ghosts of Redwood Asylum. The rain had turned into a storm by the time Ethan and Lila reached the outskirts of Willow Creek. The wind howled through the trees, and the thunder echoed like a drumbeat in the distance. They had fled Samuel Voss's mansion in a haze of fear and confusion, their minds reeling from what they had seen. The church bell, the blood-stained altar, the hooded figures. It was all too much to process. But one thing was clear: they couldn't stop now. Ethan drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Lila sat beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out the window. The photograph of Clara at the bonfire lay on the dashboard, a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Redwood Asylum," Ethan replied, his tone grim. "Clara mentioned it in her journal. If there's any clue about what happened to her, it's there." Lila nodded, though her expression was uneasy. Redwood Asylum had a reputation in Willow Creek, even among those who didn't believe in ghosts. Built in the early 1900s, it had been a place of horrors long before it was abandoned. Stories of experiments, disappearances, and suicides had turned it into a local legend. The asylum loomed on the horizon, its silhouette jagged against the stormy sky. The building was a crumbling monolith of brick and ivy, its windows shattered and its doors sealed shut. Ethan parked the truck at the edge of the property, the headlights cutting through the darkness. "You sure about this?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "No," Ethan admitted. "But we don't have a choice." They stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through their clothes almost instantly. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the wind carried the faint sound of whispers. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from the truck, its beam cutting through the darkness as they approached the asylum. The front doors were chained shut, but one of the windows was broken, its jagged edges glistening in the rain. Ethan climbed through first, his boots crunching on the glass. Lila followed, her breath visible in the cold air. The inside of the asylum was a maze of crumbling walls and rotting furniture. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Ethan's flashlight flickered as they moved through the halls, the beam catching glimpses of peeling paint and rusted metal. "This place is a nightmare," Lila whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. Ethan didn't respond. His mind was focused on one thing: finding Clara. He could feel her presence here, like a whisper in the back of his mind. They reached the main hall, its ceiling towering above them. The walls were lined with doors, each one marked with a number. Ethan's flashlight caught something on the floor, a trail of footprints, fresh and muddy. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice low. Lila's eyes widened. "Do you think it's Voss?" "I don't know, but we need to be careful." They followed the footprints down a narrow hallway, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers grew louder, though Ethan couldn't make out the words. He gripped the flashlight tighter, his heart pounding in his chest. The footprints led to a door at the end of the hall, its surface covered in rust. Ethan pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a small room, its walls lined with shelves. The shelves were filled with jars, their contents obscured by dust. But what caught Ethan's attention was the figure in the corner. It was a woman, her back turned to them. She was dressed in a tattered hospital gown, her hair matted and dirty. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as she turned to face them, her eyes hollow and her face pale. "Eleanor," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan recognized her immediately. Eleanor Voss, Samuel's estranged wife, had disappeared years ago. The town had assumed she had left him, but now it was clear she had been here all along. "Eleanor," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "We're here to help you." Eleanor didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on something behind them, her expression one of pure terror. Ethan turned, his flashlight catching the shadow of a figure in the doorway. It was Samuel Voss. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice cold. Ethan's heart pounded as Voss stepped into the room, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Behind him were the hooded figures from the mansion, their faces obscured by shadows. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. Voss smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "The same thing I've always wanted. To protect this town. To protect the pact." "The pact?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Voss ignored her, his eyes locked on Ethan. "Your sister was a threat just like you are. But she was stronger than I expected. She fought back, and now she's paying the price." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What did you do to her?" Voss's smile widened. "You'll see soon enough." Before Ethan could react, the hooded figures moved in, their hands reaching for him. He fought back, his fists connecting with flesh, but there were too many of them. He felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and the world went dark. When he woke up, he was lying on the cold stone floor of the asylum's basement. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the walls were lined with strange symbols. Lila was next to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface stained with blood. And standing above it, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're too late." Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for her, but she vanished into the shadows. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing. And then the whispers began. They came from all around him, their voices low and guttural. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their malice. He grabbed Lila's hand, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. Lila nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They ran for the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around them. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the door, his hands trembling as he pushed it open. The storm had worsened, the rain falling in sheets. Ethan and Lila ran for the truck, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold air. As they climbed inside, Ethan glanced back at the asylum, his heart sinking. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Find me." And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was running out of time. Chapter 5: The Photograph in the Attic. The storm raged on as Ethan and Lila drove away from Redwood Asylum, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The encounter with Samuel Voss and the hooded figures had left them both shaken, but there was no time to process what had happened. Clara's voice still echoed in Ethan's mind, her plea to find her driving him forward. "We need to regroup," Lila said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Ethan could see the fear in her eyes. "We can't just keep running into these situations blind." Ethan nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You're right, but where do we even start? Voss is always one step ahead of us." Lila hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Before we left the asylum, I found this in Eleanor's room. It was tucked under the mattress." Ethan glanced at the paper as Lila unfolded it. It was a map of Willow Creek, but it wasn't like any map he had seen before. The streets were labeled with strange symbols, and certain buildings were marked with red X's. One of those X's was over the Carter family home. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "I think it's a map of the town's secrets," Lila replied. "Places where the pact has done whatever it is they do. And your house is one of them." Ethan's stomach churned. He had always known there was something wrong with the house, something beyond the fire that had taken Clara. But he had never imagined it was tied to something this dark. "We need to go back," he said, his voice firm. Lila nodded, though her expression was uneasy. "If we're going to do this, we need to be smart. Voss knows we're onto him, and he's not going to let us get away again." Ethan didn't respond. His mind was already racing ahead, planning their next move. The house held answers, he was sure of it. And if there was even a chance of finding Clara, he had to take it. They reached the Carter family home just as the storm began to ease, the rain slowing to a drizzle. The house looked even more decrepit in the dim light, its windows dark and its roof sagging. Ethan parked the truck and grabbed his flashlight, his heart pounding as he approached the front door. The inside of the house was just as they had left it, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of charred wood. Ethan moved quickly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he made his way to the stairs. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "The attic," Ethan replied. "Clara used to hide things up there. If there's anything left, that's where it'll be." The attic was accessed through a narrow door at the end of the hallway, its hinges rusted and stiff. Ethan pushed it open, the wood groaning in protest. The air inside was cold and damp, the smell of mildew overwhelming. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, their contents obscured by layers of dust. Ethan's flashlight caught something in the corner, a small wooden chest, its surface carved with strange symbols. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They approached the chest cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. Ethan knelt down and opened the lid, his hands trembling. Inside was a collection of photographs, their edges frayed and their colors faded. Ethan picked up the top one, his breath catching in his throat. It was the same photograph from the bonfire, but this time he noticed something he hadn't before. In the background, barely visible, was a figure wearing a mask. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "What is that?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the photograph, his mind racing. The figure in the mask was familiar, though he couldn't place why. He set the photograph aside and picked up the next one. It was a picture of Clara, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She was standing in front of the old church, her hands bound and her mouth gagged. "Ethan," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked up, his heart pounding. Lila was holding another photograph, her hands trembling. It was a picture of the attic, taken from the same angle they were standing in now. In the center of the image was the chest, its lid open. And standing next to it, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What the hell is this?" Lila didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on something behind him, her expression one of pure terror. Ethan turned, his flashlight catching the shadow of a figure in the doorway. It was Samuel Voss. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice cold. Ethan's heart pounded as Voss stepped into the room, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Behind him were the hooded figures from the asylum, their faces obscured by shadows. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. Voss smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "The same thing I've always wanted. To protect this town. To protect the pact." "The pact?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Voss ignored her, his eyes locked on Ethan. "Your sister was a threat just like you are. But she was stronger than I expected. She fought back, and now she's paying the price." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What did you do to her?" Voss's smile widened. "You'll see soon enough." Before Ethan could react, the hooded figures moved in, their hands reaching for him. He fought back, his fists connecting with flesh, but there were too many of them. He felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and the world went dark. When he woke up, he was lying on the cold stone floor of the asylum's basement. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the walls were lined with strange symbols. Lila was next to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface stained with blood. And standing above it, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're too late." Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for her, but she vanished into the shadows. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing. And then the whispers began. They came from all around him, their voices low and guttural. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their malice. He grabbed Lila's hand, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. Lila nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They ran for the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around them. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the door, his hands trembling as he pushed it open. The storm had worsened, the rain falling in sheets. Ethan and Lila ran for the truck, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold air. As they climbed inside, Ethan glanced back at the asylum, his heart sinking. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Find me." And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was running out of time. Chapter 6. The Drowning at Silver Lake. The storm had passed, leaving the town of Willow Creek shrouded in an eerie silence. Ethan and Lila sat in the truck, the engine idling as they tried to process what had just happened. The attic, the photographs, the hooded figures, it was all too much to take in. But one thing was clear. They couldn't stop now. "We need to figure out what's going on," Lila said, her voice breaking the silence. "We can't keep running into these situations blind." Ethan nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You're right, but where do we even start? Voss is always one step ahead of us." Lila hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out the map she had found in Eleanor's room. "There's a red X over Silver Lake. If the map is marking places tied to the pact, maybe we'll find something there." Ethan's stomach churned. Silver Lake was a place of local legend, its waters dark and still. Stories of drownings and disappearances had haunted the lake for decades, and Ethan had always avoided it. But if there was a chance of finding answers, he had to take it. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. They drove in silence, the streets of Willow Creek empty and quiet. The storm had left the town in a state of eerie calm, the air thick with tension. As they approached Silver Lake, the trees grew denser, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The lake itself was a mirror of black glass, its surface undisturbed. Ethan parked the truck at the edge of the water, the headlights cutting through the darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. "This place gives me the creeps," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the lake, his mind racing. The water seemed to call to him, its surface rippling faintly as if something beneath was stirring. They walked along the shore, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves on the ground. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation, and the silence was oppressive. "What are we looking for?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, but Clara mentioned Silver Lake in her journal. She said it was a place of sacrifice. Lila's eyes widened. "Sacrifice?" What does that mean? Before Ethan could respond, a sound broke the silence. A faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. They turned toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. There, floating in the center of the lake, was a body. Ethan's heart pounded as he waded into the water, the cold biting at his skin. The body was face down, its clothes soaked and its hair floating like seaweed. He grabbed it and turned it over, his breath catching in his throat. It was Daniel Rowe, Clara's ex-boyfriend. "Oh my God," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled Daniel's body to the shore. His pockets were stuffed with pages from Clara's diary, the ink smeared and the paper waterlogged. Ethan grabbed the pages, his heart pounding as he read the words. Asterisk, "They're coming for me. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The baby. They want the baby. I can't let them take it. I won't." Asterisk. Ethan's blood ran cold. Clara had been pregnant. "What does it say?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan handed her the pages, his hands trembling. Clara was pregnant, and the pact wanted the baby. Lila's eyes widened as she read the words. "This is bigger than we thought. If they're willing to kill to protect their secrets." She didn't finish the sentence, but Ethan knew what she was thinking. The pact was dangerous, and they were running out of time. As they stood there, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Ethan turned, his flashlight catching the shadow of a figure in the trees. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps growing closer. Ethan's heart pounded as the figure emerged from the shadows, its face obscured by a hood. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice low and guttural. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was Samuel Voss. Before he could react, the hooded figures moved in, their hands reaching for him. He fought back, his fists connecting with flesh, but there were too many of them. He felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and the world went dark. When he woke up, he was lying on the cold stone floor of the asylum's basement. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the walls were lined with strange symbols. Lila was next to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface stained with blood. And standing above it, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're too late." Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for her, but she vanished into the shadows. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing. And then the whispers began. They came from all around him, their voices low and guttural. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their malice. He grabbed Lila's hand, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. Lila nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They ran for the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around them. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the door, his hands trembling as he pushed it open. The storm had worsened, the rain falling in sheets. Ethan and Lila ran for the truck, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold air. As they climbed inside, Ethan glanced back at the asylum, his heart sinking. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Find me." And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was running out of time. Chapter 7, The Forgotten Patient Files. The drive back to Willow Creek was a blur. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while Lila sat silently beside him, clutching the waterlogged pages of Clara's diary. The storm had passed, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. The image of Daniel Rowe's lifeless body floating in Silver Lake haunted Ethan's mind, and Clara's words echoed in his ears. Asterisk, "They want the baby. I can't let them take it." Asterisk. "We need to go back to Redwood Asylum," Ethan said abruptly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but there was a determination in it that made Lila look up. "What? Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That place is a death trap. Voss and his people are watching it." "Because Clara was there," Ethan replied, his eyes fixed on the road. "She mentioned it in her journal. And if she was a patient, there might be records. Files. Something that explains what happened to her." Lila hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but we need a plan. We can't just walk in there again." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We'll figure it out. But we're running out of time." The asylum loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette cutting through the night sky. Ethan parked the truck a mile away, and they approached on foot, moving silently through the trees. The storm had left the ground slick with mud, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. The asylum's main entrance was still chained shut, but Ethan remembered a side door they had passed during their last visit. It was partially hidden by overgrown ivy, its hinges rusted but intact. He pried it open with a crowbar he had grabbed from the truck, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, the asylum was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint drip of water from a leaking pipe. Ethan and Lila moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was cold, and the walls seemed to close in around them. "Where do we start?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. "The records room," Ethan replied. If Clara was a patient, there should be files. They found the records room on the second floor, its door marked with a faded sign. The room was small and cluttered, its shelves lined with dusty file boxes. Ethan's heart pounded as he began to search, his hands trembling as he flipped through the folders. "Here," Lila said suddenly, her voice sharp with urgency. She held up a file, its cover marked with Clara's name. Ethan grabbed it, his hands shaking as he opened it. Inside were pages of notes, written in a cramped, hurried script. He scanned the words, his heart sinking as he read. Asterisk, patient exhibits signs of extreme paranoia. Claims to be followed by shadow figures. Insists that her unborn child is in danger. Refuses to name the father. Subject shows signs of trauma, possibly related to recent events in Willow Creek. Asterisk. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She was telling the truth. They were after her. Lila leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the notes. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a line near the bottom of the page. Asterisk, patient admitted voluntarily. Referred by Samuel Voss. Asterisk. Ethan's blood ran cold. Voss brought her here. He's the one who locked her up. Before he could process the implications, a sound broke the silence. A faint creak, like a door opening somewhere in the asylum. Ethan and Lila froze, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "We need to go," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, but as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A photograph, tucked into the back of the file. He pulled it out, his heart pounding as he stared at it. It was a picture of Clara, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She was standing in front of the asylum, her hands bound and her mouth gagged. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was Samuel Voss. "Ethan," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked up, his heart pounding. Lila was holding another file, her hands trembling. It was marked with Eleanor Voss's name. "We need to take these," Ethan said, his voice low. "They're proof." They stuffed the files into their bags and moved toward the door, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. But as they reached the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoed through the asylum. "They're here," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's heart pounded as he grabbed her hand and pulled her into a nearby room. They crouched behind an overturned desk, their flashlights off as the footsteps grew closer. The door creaked open, and a beam of light swept across the room. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The light lingered for a moment, then moved on, the footsteps fading into the distance. "We need to get out of here," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Lila nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The asylum was a maze of hallways and rooms, and Ethan's mind raced as he tried to remember the way out. As they reached the stairs, a sound broke the silence. A faint whisper, like a voice calling his name. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. "Ethan," the voice whispered, barely audible. He turned, his flashlight catching the shadow of a figure in the doorway. It was Clara, her face pale and her eyes hollow. "Find me," she whispered, her voice trembling. And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around them. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the door, his hands trembling as he pushed it open. The storm had worsened, the rain falling in sheets. Ethan and Lila ran for the truck, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold air. As they climbed inside, Ethan glanced back at the asylum, his heart sinking. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Find me." And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was running out of time. Chapter 8. The Masquerade at Voss Manor. The files from Redwood Asylum lay spread across the motel room bed, their contents a chaotic web of secrets and lies. Ethan paced the room, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the fragments of Clara's story. The photograph of her bound and gagged, the notes about her paranoia, the mention of Samuel Voss. It all pointed to something darker than he had ever imagined. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes scanning the pages. "We need to confront Voss," she said, her voice firm. "He's at the center of this. If we can get him to talk, we might finally get some answers." Ethan stopped pacing and turned to her. "And how do you suggest we do that? He's not just going to confess to everything over tea." Lila hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled flyer. It was an invitation to a masquerade ball at Voss Manor, scheduled for that very night. "Where did you get this?" Ethan asked, his eyes narrowing. "I found it in the asylum," Lila replied. "It's an annual event for the town's elite. If we can get in, we might be able to corner Voss and force him to talk." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of walking into Voss's home, but he knew they didn't have a choice. The truth was within reach, and he couldn't let it slip away. The masquerade ball was in full swing by the time Ethan and Lila arrived at Voss Manor. The mansion was lit up like a beacon, its windows glowing with warm light. Guests in elaborate masks and gowns milled about the grand entrance, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Ethan adjusted his mask, a simple black domino that hid his face but did little to ease his nerves. Lila, dressed in a borrowed gown and a feathered mask, looked surprisingly at ease as she linked her arm with his. "Remember," she whispered as they approached the door, "we're here to blend in. Don't draw attention to yourself." Ethan nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. The last time he had been in this mansion, he had been knocked unconscious and dragged to the asylum. The thought of facing Voss again filled him with dread, but he pushed it aside. The ballroom was a spectacle of opulence, its high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers and its walls lined with gold-framed portraits. A string quartet played in the corner, their music mingling with the hum of conversation. Ethan scanned the room, his eyes searching for Voss. "There," Lila whispered, nudging him gently. Voss stood near the fireplace, his mask a grotesque bird-like design that obscured his face but not his cold, calculating eyes. He was surrounded by a group of guests, their laughter echoing through the room. "Let's move," Ethan said, his voice low. They made their way through the crowd, their masks giving them just enough anonymity to avoid suspicion. As they approached Voss, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "Mr. Voss," Lila said, her voice smooth and confident. "What a lovely event." Voss turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his mask. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "I don't believe we've met." "We're new to town," Lila replied, her smile never wavering. "We couldn't miss the opportunity to see your beautiful home." Voss's gaze shifted to Ethan, and for a moment, their eyes locked. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And who is your companion?" Voss asked, his voice cold. "A friend," Lila said quickly. "We were just admiring your art collection. That portrait over there. Is it a family heirloom?" Voss glanced at the painting she indicated, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said after a moment. "It's been in my family for generations." Ethan seized the opportunity. "Your family has quite a history in Willow Creek," he said, his voice steady. "I've heard interesting stories." Voss's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to grow colder. "Stories can be misleading," he said, his tone sharp. "I suggest you be careful what you believe." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion broke out near the entrance. A woman screamed, and the music stopped abruptly. Ethan turned, his heart pounding as he saw a figure stumbling into the ballroom. It was Eleanor Voss. Her gown was torn and stained, her hair matted and wild. She looked like a ghost, her eyes wide with fear as she scanned the room. "Samuel!" she cried, her voice trembling. "You can't keep hiding the truth. They're coming for you." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Voss. His face was a mask of fury as he strode toward Eleanor, his hands clenched into fists. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're unwell. Let me take you somewhere safe." "No!" she screamed, backing away from him. "You did this. You and your pact. You took her." Just like you took me. Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his mask forgotten. What did you do to Clara? He demanded, his voice shaking with anger. Voss turned to him, his eyes blazing. He spat. I should have known you'd show up. The guests began to murmur, their masks hiding their expressions but not their unease. Lila grabbed Ethan's arm, her grip tight. We need to go, she whispered urgently. But Ethan couldn't move. His eyes were locked on Voss, his mind racing. Where is she? He demanded, his voice rising. What did you do to my sister? Voss's lips curled into a cruel smile. You'll see soon enough, he said. Before Ethan could react, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Screams echoed through the ballroom, and Ethan felt a hand grab his arm. Run! Lila shouted, pulling him toward the door. They stumbled through the chaos, their masks discarded as they fought their way out of the mansion. The night air was cold, and the rain had started again, soaking through their clothes as they ran for the truck. As they climbed inside, Ethan glanced back at the mansion. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Find me. And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was running out of time. Chapter 9. The Fractured Confession. The rain hammered against the windshield as Ethan drove away from Voss Manor, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The chaos of the masquerade ball still echoed in his mind. Eleanor's screams, Voss's cold smile, Clara's ghostly apparition. Lila sat beside him, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched the files they had taken from the asylum. We need to go to the police, she said, her voice breaking the silence. We have proof now. Voss can't keep hiding behind his power. Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched. The police won't do anything. Voss owns this town. We need to find someone who's not afraid of him. Lila hesitated, then nodded. Marcus Holt. He's the only one who's been willing to talk so far. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of returning to the pawn shop, but he knew she was right. Marcus had been the one to give him Clara's letter, and if anyone knew the full extent of Voss's secrets, it was him. The pawn shop was dark when they arrived, the neon sign flickering weakly in the rain. Ethan pounded on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Marcus, he shouted. Open up. There was no response, but Ethan thought he saw a flicker of movement inside. He pounded on the door again, his frustration boiling over. Marcus, I know you're in there. We need to talk. Finally, the door creaked open, and Marcus peered out, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. What do you want? He asked, his voice trembling. Answers, Ethan said, pushing past him into the shop. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and old metal, the shelves cluttered with trinkets and oddities. Marcus closed the door behind them, his hands shaking as he turned to face Ethan. You shouldn't have come here, he said, his voice low. Voss knows you're onto him. He's not going to let you walk away. I don't care, Ethan snapped. I need to know what happened to Clara. And you're going to tell me? Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting to Lila, who stood silently by the door. Then he sighed and slumped into a chair, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. It's too late, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's gone. Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped closer. What do you mean she's gone? Where is she? Marcus looked up at him, his eyes filled with pain. Voss, he's been running this town for years. He's got his fingers in everything, the police, the mayor's office, even the church. And he's got a group of people who do his dirty work. They call themselves the Pact. Ethan's stomach churned. What does that have to do with Clara? Marcus hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blood-stained photograph. It was the same one Ethan had seen in the asylum. Clara, bound and gagged, with Voss standing behind her. Clara found out about the Pact, Marcus said, his voice trembling. She was digging into their rituals, their sacrifices. Voss couldn't let her expose them, so he had her locked up in the asylum. But she fought back. She tried to escape, and they drowned her in Silver Lake. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. No, he whispered, his voice shaking. That's not true. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Ethan. I tried to stop them, but I was too late. Voss threatened to kill me if I ever told anyone. Ethan's hands shook as he grabbed Marcus by the collar, his anger boiling over. You knew? You knew what happened to her? And you didn't say anything? Marcus didn't resist, his face pale and his eyes filled with regret. I was scared, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't have a choice. Before Ethan could respond, a sound broke the silence. A faint click, like the cocking of a gun. He turned, his heart pounding as he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Samuel Voss. You just can't stay out of my business? Can you? Voss said, his voice cold. Ethan's blood ran cold as Voss stepped into the room, a gun in his hand. Behind him were the hooded figures from the asylum, their faces obscured by shadows. You're too late, Voss said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. The pact is stronger than you can imagine. And Clara, she's where she belongs. Ethan's hands shook as he stepped forward, his anger overriding his fear. What did you do to her? Voss's smile widened. She's part of something bigger now, something eternal. Before Ethan could react, a shot rang out, the sound deafening in the small space. Marcus crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. No! Ethan shouted, rushing to Marcus's side. Marcus looked up at him, his eyes filled with pain. Find her, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She's still out there. And then he was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he stood, his eyes locked on Voss. You're going to pay for this, he said, his voice trembling with rage. Voss laughed, a cold, hollow sound. You're welcome to try. Before Ethan could move, the hooded figures closed in, their hands reaching for him. He fought back, his fists connecting with flesh, but there were too many of them. He felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and the world went dark. When he woke up, he was lying on the cold stone floor of the asylum's basement. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the walls were lined with strange symbols. Lila was next to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface stained with blood. And standing above it, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're too late. Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for her, but she vanished into the shadows. The room was silent, save for the sound of his own breathing. And then the whispers began. They came from all around him, their voices low and guttural. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he could feel their malice. He grabbed Lila's hand, his mind racing. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice trembling. Lila nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They ran for the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the chaos. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around them. Ethan's heart pounded as they reached the door, his hands trembling as he pushed it open. The storm had worsened, the rain falling in sheets. Ethan and Lila ran for the truck, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold air. As they climbed inside, Ethan glanced back at the asylum, his heart sinking. Standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Find me. And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was running out of time. Chapter 10. The Inferno of Truth. The storm raged on as Ethan drove through the empty streets of Willow Creek, the rain pounding against the windshield like a drumbeat. Lila sat beside him, her face pale and her hands clutching the blood-stained files they had taken from Marcus Holt's pawn shop. The weight of what they had learned hung heavy in the air. Clara's disappearance, the pact, the sacrifices. But one thing was clear. They couldn't stop now. We need to end this, Ethan said, his voice low and steady. Voss has been controlling this town for too long. It's time to burn it all down. Lila looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. What are you talking about? Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Voss Manor is the heart of everything. If we destroy it, we destroy the pact. Lila hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but we need to be smart about this. Voss isn't going to let us walk in there and set the place on fire. Ethan's jaw clenched. We'll figure it out. But we're running out of time. Voss Manor loomed in the distance, its windows glowing with warm light despite the storm. Ethan parked the truck a mile away, and they approached on foot, moving silently through the trees. The rain soaked through their clothes, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing, ending this. They reached the edge of the property, the mansion's silhouette jagged against the stormy sky. Ethan pulled a can of gasoline from his bag, his hands trembling as he unscrewed the cap. Are you sure about this? Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, His eyes locked on the mansion. It's the only way. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the rain. The mansion was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the storm. Ethan poured the gasoline along the base of the house, the smell sharp and acrid in the cold air. As they reached the back of the mansion, a sound broke the silence. A faint creak, like a door opening. Ethan froze, his heart pounding as he turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway was Samuel Voss. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Voss said, his voice cold. Ethan's blood ran cold as Voss stepped into the rain, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Behind him were the hooded figures from the asylum, their faces obscured by shadows. "It's over, Voss," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We know everything." Voss laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a nuisance." Before Ethan could respond, Lila stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "You took Clara. You took Eleanor. How many others have you hurt?" Voss's smile widened. "As many as it takes to keep the pack strong." Ethan's hands shook as he reached into his bag and pulled out a lighter. "This ends tonight." Voss's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to grow colder. "You're making a mistake." Ethan didn't respond. He flicked the lighter, the flame flickering in the rain. Then he threw it onto the gasoline-soaked ground, the fire roaring to life with a deafening whoosh. The flames spread quickly, consuming the base of the mansion and climbing toward the windows. Voss's eyes widened with fear as he realized what was happening. "You fool!" he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan didn't answer. He grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her away from the mansion, their footsteps muffled by the rain. The flames grew higher, their light casting long shadows across the property. As they reached the edge of the trees, Ethan turned back to look at the mansion. The flames had reached the roof, their light illuminating the stormy sky. And standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes hollow, was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're too late." Ethan's heart pounded as he reached for her, but she vanished into the flames. The mansion collapsed in on itself, the sound deafening as the fire consumed everything in its path. Ethan's hands shook as he watched the flames, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he had finally faced it. The storm had passed by the time the fire burned itself out, leaving nothing but ashes and smoke. Ethan and Lila stood at the edge of the property, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold air. "It's over," Lila said, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, though his heart was heavy. "Not yet. Clara's still out there, and I'm going to find her." Lila looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "Ethan," before she could finish, a sound broke the silence. A faint whisper, like a voice calling his name. Ethan turned, his heart pounding as he saw a figure standing in the ashes. It was Clara. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Find me." And then she was gone. Ethan's hands shook as he started the engine, his mind reeling. The truth was out there, waiting for him, and he was ready to face it.